Did medieval women really just sit around spinning wool and waiting for knights? Were they truly powerless, confined to castles and cottages from the 5th to the 15th century? Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew. Number 8. Medieval women were completely excluded from political power. Many people picture medieval politics as a room full of stern-faced men, kings, nobles, and bishops, making all the decisions. The idea that women had no say, no influence, no direct hand in the grand tapestry of power seems like a given, a settled fact of history. The popular image is one of women existing solely in the domestic sphere, far removed from the council chambers and battlefields where power was truly wielded. Yet, dig a little deeper, and the picture becomes far more complex, revealing women who not only influenced politics but actively shaped kingdoms, led armies, and dictated policies. Their power was not always direct or acknowledged in the same ways as men's, but it was undeniably present and often formidable. Consider the role of the queen. She was not merely a decorative figurehead. A queen consort held a position of immense strategic importance. Her marriage was often a diplomatic alliance, securing peace or cementing claims to land and titles. Her primary duty was to produce heirs, but her influence extended far beyond the nursery. Queens often managed the royal household, a massive undertaking that was essentially the heart of the kingdom's administration. They oversaw finances, managed staff, and entertained foreign dignitaries, acting as vital conduits for information and influence. A queen could, and often did, act as a political advisor to her husband, offering counsel, advocating for specific policies, and even engaging in subtle manipulation to achieve her goals. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a name that echoes through history, stands as a towering example. She was not just a queen, she was a sovereign duchess in her own right, controlling vast territories. She accompanied her first husband, Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade, a venture fraught with political and logistical challenges, demonstrating an unusual level of involvement for a queen. Later, as Queen of England to Henry II, she was a political force, involving herself in her son's rebellions against their father, a risky but undeniably political act. Even when imprisoned by Henry, her influence persisted, a testament to her enduring power. Beyond the queen consort, there were queens, regnant, and regents. A queen regnant ruled in her own name, inheriting the throne just as a king would. Matilda of England, granddaughter of William the Conqueror, fought a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy for the English throne in the 12th century. Though she never truly secured the crown, her struggle demonstrated her unwavering claim and her ability to command armies and loyalties against powerful male rivals. And later, Isabella of France, queen consort of Edward II of England, became a formidable political player. When her husband's weak and unpopular rule led to chaos, Isabella, with her lover Roger Mortimer, led an invasion of England, deposed her husband, and ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III. This was a direct, forceful seizure of political power, shattering any notion of women being mere background figures. Another powerful regent was Blanche of Castile, who governed France for her young son, Louis IX, in the 13th century. Blanche faced down rebellious barons, negotiated treaties, and managed the kingdom's finances with exceptional skill and determination. She was known for a shrewd political mind and firm hand, ensuring stability and prosperity during her regency. Noblewomen, too, held significant sway. The lady of a castle was not just a domestic manager, she was often responsible for administering her husband's estates when he was away, which was often, given the frequency of wars, crusades, and courtly duties. This meant overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents, administering justice in local courts, and managing the castle's defenses. A noblewoman might find herself leading the defense of her castle during a siege, as countless historical accounts attest. They were not merely passive victims awaiting rescue, they were active participants in holding and defending their family's power base. Their roles as landowners and administrators gave them direct political influence over their tenants and the local populace, often more than their male counterparts who were away at war. They forged alliances through their children's marriages, influencing vast networks of power and kinship. Even women in religious life, particularly abbesses, wielded considerable political power. An abbess of a wealthy and influential convent often controlled vast tracts of land, managing estates, tenants, and revenues that rivaled those of secular lords. They were often women from powerful noble families, bringing with them connections and prestige. Abbesses sometimes sat in parliamentary assemblies or advised rulers, and their convents served as important centers of learning, diplomacy, and even refuge for political figures. They were feudal lords in their own right, responsible for justice within their domains and often supplying knights or funds to the king. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was not only a renowned mystic, composer, and natural philosopher, but also a prolific correspondent who advised emperors, kings, and popes on political and spiritual matters. Her letters reveal a woman deeply engaged with the political and religious issues of her day, unafraid to offer strong, even prophetic, counsel to the most powerful men in Europe. Her authority derived from her spiritual visions but was translated into very real political influence. Diplomacy was another arena where women often played crucial roles. Royal and noble marriages, as mentioned, were foundational to medieval diplomacy. But women also acted as envoys, conveying messages, negotiating alliances, and representing their family's interests at foreign courts. Their ability to move between courts, often under the guise of visits or pilgrimages, allowed them to gather intelligence and facilitate communication in ways that male diplomats might have struggled with. They could use their social skills and family connections to build relationships and influence decisions behind the scenes, away from the rigid formalities of official male-dominated negotiations. The very social structures that sometimes constrained women also provided unique avenues for influence. The political power of medieval women was not always overt or formally recognized in written law. It was often exercised through networks of patronage, kinship, and subtle influence. Yet, to dismiss it as non-existent is to ignore a vast swathe of historical evidence. From the queens who governed empires in the absence of their husbands or sons, to the noblewomen who defended their strongholds and managed their lands, to the abbesses who commanded spiritual and temporal authority, women were actively engaged in the political landscape of the Middle Ages. Their impact shaped dynastic successions, diplomatic relations, and the daily lives of countless people. Their stories challenge the long-held misconception that political power was an exclusively male domain. They remind us that history is often far more nuanced and surprising than popular narratives suggest. Number 7. All medieval women were illiterate and uneducated. The image of the medieval woman often includes the notion that she was entirely unlettered, unable to read or write, her world confined to domestic duties and oral traditions. The common belief is that education, particularly literacy, was reserved almost exclusively for men, especially those in the clergy or those destined for positions of power. This view suggests that women lived in a world without books, without the ability to engage with written texts, and therefore were shut off from intellectual pursuits and formal learning. However, this sweeping generalization obscures a much more varied and vibrant reality. While universal literacy was certainly not a feature of the Middle Ages for either gender, many women across different social strata did acquire an education, sometimes quite a profound one, enabling them to read, write, and even contribute to the intellectual life of their time. For aristocratic women, education was often an integral part of their upbringing, though its purpose might have differed from that of their male counterparts. Noble daughters were trained not just in domestic management, but also in the skills necessary to run large households and estates. This frequently included literacy and numeracy. How could a lady manage complex accounts, inventories, and correspondence for vast lands and numerous servants without being able to read and write? She needed to read charters, legal documents, and letters, and often draft replies. This was practical education, certainly, but it involved acquiring significant literacy skills. Beyond practicalities, noblewomen were sometimes educated in languages, history, and even Latin, especially if they were expected to hold prominent positions at court, where intellectual discourse was valued. They were often patrons of literature, commissioning illuminated manuscripts and new works, and it is difficult to be a discerning patron without the ability to appreciate the written word. They collected books, built small libraries, and engaged with the texts they owned. Convents played a crucial role in female education, acting as centers of learning for nuns and often for secular women as well. Daughters of noble and wealthy families were often sent to convents not necessarily to become nuns, but to receive an education that included reading, writing, Latin, music, and religious instruction. For those who did become nuns, intellectual life was often vibrant. Nuns copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, composed hymns and treatises, and engaged in theological debate. They were among the most highly educated women of their time, and their intellectual contributions were significant. Hildegard of Bingen, mentioned earlier, is a prime example of a convent-educated woman who mastered Latin, theology, natural science, and music, producing an astounding body of work. Anne Rotsvit of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness, wrote Latin dramas and epic poems, making her one of the earliest known female playwrights in European history. These women were not isolated cases. They represent a tradition of female intellectualism fostered within monastic walls. Even outside the aristocracy and religious orders, evidence suggests that some urban women achieved literacy, particularly those involved in trade and commerce. A merchant's wife might need to keep records, manage ledgers, and correspond with suppliers or customers. In bustling market towns, the ability to read and write was a practical asset for running a business or assisting a husband in his trade. On-guild records sometimes indicate that women were involved in the business aspects of their family enterprises, which often necessitated a degree of literacy. While basic literacy might have been more common than advanced scholarship, it nonetheless challenges the idea of universal female illiteracy. The very existence of works written by women in the Middle Ages is perhaps the most direct refutation of the misconception. Christine de Pizan, writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, was a professional writer and philosopher, one of the first women to support herself through her pen. Her prolific works, including the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of the Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, demonstrate not only her literacy but her deep knowledge of history, philosophy, and political theory. She was educated by her scholar father and had access to extensive libraries, defying the stereotype of the uneducated woman. Her work actively defended women and championed their intellectual capabilities, itself a product of an educated mind. Julian of Norwich, a mystic of the same period, penned Revelations of Divine Love, one of the earliest surviving books in the English language written by a woman, showcasing her profound theological understanding and literary skill. Marjorie Kempe, another 15th century mystic, dictated her autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, to scribes, implying a degree of self-awareness and narrative structure that comes from engaging with literary forms, even if she herself was not fully literate in the formal sense. The fact that her words were deemed worthy of preservation in written form speaks volumes about the value placed on certain female voices. Of course, the extent of female literacy varied greatly by region, social class, and historical period. The vast majority of the population, male or female, was illiterate in the Middle Ages. But to say that all women were uneducated is a misrepresentation. Education for medieval women might not have always mirrored the formal schooling of modern times, or even the male-dominated university system of their era. It was often pragmatic, rooted in household management, religious devotion, or economic necessity. Yet, it equipped many women with the skills to read, write, and engage intellectually with the world around them. They were readers of religious texts, administrative documents, and sometimes even secular romances and histories. They were also writers, contributing their voices to literature, philosophy, and theology. Their intellectual lives, though often overlooked in popular imagination, were rich and diverse, challenging the narrow confines of historical stereotype. Number 6. Women were only defined by their roles as wives and mothers. The pervasive image of medieval women often reduces their entire existence to two primary functions, being a wife and being a mother. This narrative suggests that a woman's identity, purpose, and social standing were solely derived from her marital status and her ability to bear children, particularly male heirs. The idea is that if a woman was not married or did not have children, she somehow lacked full societal recognition or purpose, confined to a life of quiet anonymity or social marginalization. This perception, however, significantly narrows the vast range of experiences and identities that medieval women inhabited. Many women lived rich, meaningful lives outside or beyond these conventional roles, forging identities as independent workers, religious figures, community leaders, and even as single women navigating the complexities of medieval society on their own terms. Consider the role of the widow. And far from becoming an insignificant figure, a widow, especially one of property, often gained a remarkable degree of autonomy and power. Upon her husband's death, a widow typically inherited dower rights, which usually amounted to 1/3 of his property for her lifetime, ensuring her financial independence. In some cases, a widow might inherit the entirety of her husband's estate, especially if there were no adult sons, or if she was named as the sole heir. This financial independence allowed widows to manage their own land, businesses, and households without the direct legal oversight of a husband. They could buy and sell property, engage in trade, lend money, and bring lawsuits in their own name. Many urban women continued their late husbands' businesses, often successfully, proving themselves capable entrepreneurs and managers. They were not merely grieving figures, but active economic agents contributing to and shaping their communities. A widow's social status was often elevated. She was no longer under her father's or husband's authority, but was considered a legal individual capable of independent action. This was a position of respect and influence, often sought after for advice and counsel within her family and community. Religious life offered another powerful alternative to marriage and motherhood. Women who chose to become nuns or who joined Beguine communities dedicated their lives to spiritual pursuits, but in doing so, they found avenues for intellectual, social, and even administrative power that marriage often did not provide. Nuns lived in communities of women, often highly educated, where they could pursue scholarship, artistic endeavors, and leadership roles. Abbesses, as explored before, managed vast estates, wielded significant temporal and spiritual authority, and were influential figures in local and even national politics. Beguines, an informal movement of devout women who lived together in communities without taking formal vows, were particularly significant in urban areas. They engaged in charitable work, textile production, and intellectual pursuits, providing a communal life for women outside the traditional family structure and the strictures of monastic orders. These women found spiritual fulfillment and a sense of purpose beyond the domestic sphere, often contributing greatly to the social welfare and economic life of their towns. Beyond the formal structures of widowhood and religious orders, many women lived as single individuals for various reasons. Some spinsters, unmarried women, lived independently, perhaps inheriting property or supporting themselves through various trades. They might have been domestic servants, craftswomen, or working in the burgeoning urban economies as brewers, bakers, embroiderers, or shopkeepers. These women, while perhaps facing different social expectations, carved out lives for themselves outside the confines of marriage. Not all women married, and not all marriages produced children. The medieval period was marked by high mortality rates, and many women outlived their husbands or children, or simply never found a suitable match. To assume that their lives were therefore less meaningful or complete is to impose a modern idealized view of family on a very different historical reality. Furthermore, even within the roles of wife and mother, women's identities were not solely defined by these biological and social functions. A wife was often a partner in her husband's enterprise, whether it was farming, a craft, or trade. She managed the household, which was often a complex economic unit, overseeing food production, textile manufacturing, and child rearing. This was not a passive role, but one requiring significant skill, labor, and decision-making. In urban areas, women were often integral to family businesses, running shops, serving customers, and managing finances. They were not just wives, they were co-workers, managers, and economic contributors, often indispensable to the family's financial well-being. A mother was certainly responsible for child rearing, but this role also included the transmission of culture, religious values, and practical skills. Aristocratic mothers were responsible for educating their children, sometimes hiring tutors or sending them to other noble households, a significant social and logistical undertaking. Their influence on their children's upbringing and future prospects was immense. The misconception that women were solely defined by their roles as wives and mothers fails to account for the diverse realities of medieval life. It ignores the significant agency and independence of widows, the profound spiritual and intellectual lives of nuns and beguines, and the economic contributions of single and working women. It overlooks the active partnership many wives had in their families' economic ventures. Medieval society, for all its patriarchal structures, was far more fluid and allowed for a greater variety of female roles and identities than is often understood. Women were not a monolith. They were individuals who adapted to circumstances, seized opportunities, and shaped their own paths, often defying the narrow confines of prescribed gender roles. Number 5, medieval medicine ignored women's health. The popular imagination often conjures an image of medieval medicine as primitive, largely male-dominated, and utterly unconcerned with the specific health needs of women, particularly those related to reproduction. It is often assumed that women's bodies were poorly understood, treatments were non-existent or harmful, and childbirth was a solely dangerous, unassisted ordeal. This view suggests that women suffered in silence, their health concerns dismissed, or simply not addressed by the formal medical establishment. However, this is a significant oversimplification of a complex reality. While medieval medicine certainly had its limitations, it recognized and often specialized in women's health, with specific roles for female practitioners and a body of knowledge dedicated to gynecological and obstetrical care. Midwives were arguably the most important healthcare providers for women in the Middle Ages. They were almost exclusively female and played a central, indispensable role in childbirth and postnatal care. Midwives were highly respected figures within their communities, often possessing extensive practical knowledge passed down through generations. They attended births, comforted mothers, performed basic medical procedures like cutting the umbilical cord, and advised on infant care. Their expertise was crucial in a time of high infant and maternal mortality. They were not just birth attendants, they were often confidantes, spiritual guides, and the primary source of information on women's reproductive health. Their knowledge was practical, observational, and based on centuries of experience, a stark contrast to the theoretical and often less practical knowledge found in academic medical texts. In many places, midwives were licensed by local authorities or guilds, indicating a formal recognition of their profession and the standards expected of them. This licensing often included an oath to provide honest and diligent care, highlighting their professional standing. Beyond midwives, a significant number of female healers practiced in medieval Europe. These women were often herbalists, skilled in identifying and preparing medicinal plants for a wide range of ailments, including those specific to women. They might operate in rural areas, serving their local communities, or in urban settings, running small apothecaries or offering their services to a wider clientele. Some of these women were known as wise women or cunning women, figures who combined practical medical knowledge with folk remedies and sometimes spiritual practices. While their methods might not align with modern scientific understanding, they were often the most accessible and affordable healthcare option for the common person, and their knowledge of traditional remedies was extensive. They treated everything from fevers and infections to skin conditions and digestive problems, often with surprising effectiveness. Furthermore, there was a specialized body of written medical knowledge dedicated to women's health. The Trotula texts, a collection of 3 treatises originating from the medical school of Salerno in southern Italy around the 11th or 12th century, are perhaps the most famous example. These texts, traditionally attributed to a female physician named Trotta of Salerno, covered topics such as gynecology, obstetrics, and cosmetics, offering detailed advice on menstruation, conception, pregnancy, childbirth, and postnatal care. While the authorship is debated and the text likely evolved over time, their very existence demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of women's specific physiological needs and a dedicated effort to address them within the framework of medieval medicine. These texts were widely copied and circulated across Europe, influencing medical practice for centuries. They discuss ailments unique to women, advise on hygiene, and offer treatments for various conditions, indicating that women's health was indeed a subject of serious medical study and concern. Convents also played a role in women's health care. Many convents had infirmaries where nuns cared for their sick sisters, and often for the local community, including women. Nuns might possess medical knowledge, both practical and learned, from the texts available in their monastic libraries. They would prepare remedies, offer nursing care, and provide a compassionate environment for the sick. Some convents were renowned for their healing abilities and herbal gardens, attracting people seeking cures from far and wide. It is true that formal medical training in universities was largely restricted to men, as universities were ecclesiastical institutions that generally excluded women. This meant that academically trained physicians were predominantly male. However, these male physicians often relied on the knowledge and skills of midwives and female healers, especially for procedures like childbirth, which they might have considered unseemly or simply preferred not to attend. There was a division of labor and expertise within the medieval medical world, with female practitioners often dominating the practical aspects of women's health. The misconception that medieval medicine ignored women's health stems from an overemphasis on formal, male-dominated institutions and a neglect of the robust informal and practical medical traditions. These women were not passive recipients of male medical care. They were often the primary caregivers, possessing a deep and specialized knowledge of female bodies and ailments. They were the midwives guiding women through childbirth, the herbalists providing remedies, and the nuns offering compassionate care. The existence of dedicated medical texts, skilled practitioners, and a recognized sphere of women's healthcare challenges the narrow view that medieval women suffered without medical attention. Their health was a recognized and addressed concern, managed by a network of female expertise that was indispensable to medieval society. Number 4. Women had no economic agency. The popular notion often holds that medieval women were entirely dependent on men for their economic survival. The image is one of women confined to the domestic sphere, consuming resources but not producing them, excluded from trade, commerce, and property ownership. This suggests that women had no independent means of income, no control over wealth, and no ability to contribute meaningfully to the broader economy outside of their household chores. This view, however, is far from accurate and overlooks the significant, diverse, and often indispensable economic roles women played throughout the Middle Ages, from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest noblewoman. They were active participants in various sectors of the economy, holding property, running businesses, and contributing vital labor to the household and wider market. For the vast majority of the population, who lived in rural areas, the household was the primary economic unit. In this context, women's labor was absolutely essential. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, participating in planting, harvesting, and threshing. They managed livestock, spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth, prepared food, brewed ale, and collected fuel and water. These tasks were not merely domestic chores, but vital economic activities that contributed directly to the family's subsistence and often generated surplus for market. A peasant household simply could not survive or thrive without the full economic participation of its female members. Their work was physically demanding and directly productive, fundamental to the agricultural economy that underpinned medieval society. In urban areas, women were even more visible as economic agents. Many medieval towns and cities saw women actively participating in various trades and crafts. They ran taverns, alehouses, and bakeries. They were engaged in food processing, selling cheese, butter, eggs, and bread in markets. Women worked as spinners, weavers, embroiderers, and seamstresses, contributing to the flourishing textile industry. They were sellers of small goods, shopkeepers, and even moneylenders. It was common for wives to work alongside their husbands in family businesses, often taking over the management entirely if the husband was ill, away, or had died. They would be the public face of the business, interacting with customers, keeping accounts, and overseeing production. Guild records sometimes show women as members, or even as heads of guilds, particularly in trades related to food or textiles. This indicates not only their direct involvement, but also their professional recognition and regulation within the economic structure. For example, in Paris, there were over 100 guilds by the 13th century, and many of them allowed women members, sometimes with equal rights to men. Property ownership was another key aspect of women's economic agency. While laws regarding property varied by region and time period, many women had rights to own, inherit, and manage property. Dower rights, as mentioned earlier, ensured that a widow received a portion of her husband's land or income for her lifetime, providing her with economic independence. Daughters could inherit property, especially in the absence of sons or through specific legal arrangements. Noblewomen, in particular, could inherit vast estates and titles, which gave them significant economic power, controlling lands, tenants, and revenues. They managed these estates, overseeing agricultural production, timber felling, mining, and rental income, often with great skill and acumen. This wasn't merely stewardship, it was active economic management that contributed to their wealth and influence. Women also engaged in finance. They lent money, acted as sureties, and managed their own personal wealth. The dowry a woman brought into a marriage was legally her property, and in many systems she retained control over it. This meant she had a personal fund that she could use for investments, purchases, or to support family members. Wealthy women engaged in significant patronage, commissioning works of art, building projects, and supporting scholars, which had a direct economic impact on artisans, builders, and intellectuals. Single women, whether spinsters or widows, had to be economically self-sufficient or supported by family. Many worked as domestic servants, providing essential labor in households, or as independent craftswomen. The very fact that these women could support themselves economically challenges the idea of universal female dependence. While their lives might have been harder, their existence demonstrates that economic agency was not exclusively tied to marriage or male guardianship. The economic agency of medieval women was not always equal to that of men, and it certainly varied by social class, region, and specific legal traditions. However, to say that women had no economic agency is a profound misunderstanding. From the fields to the marketplaces, from the household to the royal court, women were integral to the medieval economy. They produced goods, managed resources, ran businesses, owned property, and contributed their labor in ways that were essential for the functioning of society. Their economic roles were diverse and critical, and their contributions were far more substantial and pervasive than the common narrative suggests, shaping the economic landscape of their world in myriad ways. Number 3. Chivalry uplifted women but kept them subservient. The concept of chivalry, with its emphasis on courtly love and the veneration of ladies, is often viewed as a double-edged sword for medieval women. On one hand, it seemed to elevate women to a pedestal, inspiring knights to acts of bravery and courtesy in their name. On the other, critics often argue that this elevation was superficial, that it objectified women, stripping them of genuine agency by placing them in an idealized, yet ultimately passive, role. The idea is that chivalry, while outwardly respectful, ultimately reinforced women's subservience by focusing on their beauty and virtue rather than their intellect or active participation in society, keeping them confined to the role of a muse or a prize rather than a person with inherent power. However, this interpretation misses the subtle ways in which women leverage the very ideals of chivalry to assert influence, shape culture, and even exert indirect power. Of chivalry was a complex code of conduct, a set of ideals that knights were supposed to embody, encompassing bravery, loyalty, honor, and courtesy. A significant part of this code was the veneration of women, particularly the lady of the courtly love tradition. The knight would pledge his devotion to a noble lady, often a married one, and strive to prove his worth through deeds of arms and acts of self-improvement. This ideal of the lady, while often romanticized, gave women a powerful symbolic position. They became the arbiters of a knight's honor, the inspiration for his actions. In a society where honor was paramount, the lady's approval or disapproval held considerable weight. This symbolic power could translate into real influence. And women, especially noble women, acted as patrons of chivalric literature and tournaments. They commissioned romances, epic poems, and songs that celebrated chivalric ideals and often featured strong, intelligent female characters. By doing so, they not only shaped the narratives that defined chivalry, but also influenced the values and behaviors of the knightly class. They dictated the themes, the emphasis, and the portrayal of women within these popular cultural forms, effectively molding the very ideals that supposedly govern their own lives. At tournaments, women were often present, their presence encouraging knights to perform acts of valor. A lady's favor, a scarf, or a sleeve given to a knight was a highly prized token, signifying her recognition and approval of his chivalric prowess. This subtle system of patronage and approbation gave women a significant role in the performance and perpetuation of chivalry. Furthermore, the concept of courtly love, though idealized and often platonic, provided an outlet for female influence. The lady, often portrayed as intellectually and morally superior to her knightly admirer, was not a passive recipient of adoration. She was sometimes depicted as setting the rules, offering guidance, and even demanding specific actions from her suitor. Her moral authority could be significant. In the courts where these ideals flourished, women, by virtue of their position as the object of this refined adoration, could hold sway over male behavior, encouraging politeness, restraint, and honorable conduct. While this was not direct political power, it was a form of social and cultural power, shaping the very ethos of the aristocratic elite. Chivalric literature, such as the Arthurian romances, often depicted women as not only beautiful and virtuous, but also intelligent, resourceful, and capable of independent action. Guinevere, though often portrayed as adulteress, is a queen with agency. Morgan Le Fay is a powerful sorceress. These literary representations, while fictional, reflected and possibly influenced contemporary perceptions of women's capabilities. They offered examples of women who, within their narratives, held sway, made choices, and affected the course of events, often through their cunning, wisdom, or magical abilities. While chivalry certainly had its limitations, and could be seen as reinforcing certain gender norms, it also paradoxically provided a framework within which women could exercise influence. By being the objects of veneration, women were able to dictate, subtly or overtly, certain aspects of male behavior and aristocratic culture. They were patrons of the art that defined chivalry, and their approval was a valuable commodity for ambitious knights. The idealization inherent in chivalry, while potentially restrictive, also elevated women to a position of moral and cultural authority that they could leverage. It was a complex dynamic, not simply one of subservience, but one where women actively engaged with, and sometimes manipulated, the very ideals that were meant to define their status, turning symbolic power into tangible influence within the aristocratic world. This nuanced view challenges the simplistic idea that chivalry merely kept women in their place, rather. It provided a unique arena for subtle power plays and cultural shaping. Number 2. Women were powerless in religious life. A common misconception about medieval women is that they were entirely subjugated within the rigid, patriarchal structures of the church, having no voice, no authority, and no significant role beyond being passive worshippers or cloistered figures with limited influence. The image is often of a church dominated by male clergy, bishops, abbots, and priests, with women relegated to a secondary, silent position. This perspective overlooks the profound spiritual authority, administrative power, and intellectual contributions that many women achieved within, and sometimes even challenged the confines of medieval religious life. From powerful abbesses to influential mystics, women carved out vital roles that deeply impacted religious practice, theological thought, and even the broader society. Abbesses were perhaps the most overt examples of women wielding significant power within the church structure. As heads of convents, particularly large and wealthy double monasteries that housed both monks and nuns, abbesses were formidable figures. They were often drawn from noble families, bringing with them not only social prestige but also extensive networks of political and economic influence. An abbess controlled vast estates, managed numerous tenants, administered justice within her lands, and oversaw considerable revenues. Her position was akin to that of a feudal lord, making her a powerful temporal ruler in her own right. She held authority over both male and female monastics within her jurisdiction, a remarkable position of power within a male-dominated institution. Abbesses sometimes participated in royal councils, advised rulers, and engaged in diplomatic correspondence. They were patrons of art and learning, commissioning manuscripts, funding building projects, and fostering intellectual life within their convents. These convents often served as educational centers for noble girls and as repositories of learning, preserving knowledge and culture. The power of an abbess like Hildegard of Bingen, who corresponded with emperors and popes, daring to offer them sharp criticism and prophetic warnings, demonstrates the profound authority some women could achieve within religious life. Beyond formal administrative power, many medieval women gained immense spiritual authority as mystics, visionaries, and saints. These women often claimed direct communication with God, experiencing divine visions, and receiving spiritual insights that were highly valued in medieval society. Their experiences transcended earthly hierarchies, giving them a unique form of power that even popes and kings respected. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century Dominican tertiary, was an illiterate woman who became an incredibly influential figure. She corresponded with popes, urged them to return from Avignon to Rome, mediated political disputes, and advised rulers across Europe. Her spiritual authority was so profound that she was seen as a moral compass for the church and secular leaders alike. Bridget of Sweden, a 14th century noblewoman and mystic, founded the Brigittine order, which had a unique structure allowing nuns and monks to live in adjacent but separate communities under the ultimate authority of the abbess. Her revelations influenced theological thought and were widely disseminated. Julian of Norwich, an anchorite, wrote Revelations of Divine Love, a profound theological work that explored divine love and suffering, offering a uniquely compassionate perspective that continues to resonate today. These women's spiritual experiences and writings deeply influenced religious thought and practice, and their voices were heard and respected across society. The Beguine movement, while not a formal religious order, offered an alternative path for women seeking a devout life outside traditional monasticism or marriage. Beguines lived in communities, often in urban areas, dedicating themselves to prayer, charitable work, and textile production. They were self-supporting, pious women who lived semi-religious lives without taking permanent vows, offering a degree of independence and communal support. Their existence demonstrates a desire by women to shape their own spiritual paths and to live lives of purpose outside traditional societal norms, and they exerted considerable influence in their local communities through their piety and charitable work. Women were also crucial in the veneration of saints and the promotion of popular piety. They were often the primary recipients and disseminators of saintly cults, fostering devotion to figures like the Virgin Mary and female saints, whose stories and miracles offered solace and inspiration. Pilgrimages, a central aspect of medieval religious life, often involved women, either as pilgrims seeking spiritual benefit or as figures who organized and supported these journeys. While the formal sacramental priesthood was exclusively male in the medieval church, it is a narrow view to assume that this meant women were powerless in all aspects of religious life. The spiritual authority of mystics, the administrative power of abbesses, and the vibrant lives of beguines demonstrate that women found diverse and powerful avenues for religious expression and influence. They contributed to theological discourse, managed vast spiritual and temporal enterprises, and inspired countless people through their piety and visions. Their roles were not just passive or secondary, they were active, foundational, and often revolutionary, deeply shaping the religious landscape of the Middle Ages. Number 1. Medieval women had no legal rights. The persistent myth that medieval women were entirely devoid of legal rights is one of the most pervasive misconceptions about their historical status. This viewpoint often imagines women as perpetual minors, legally invisible, unable to own property, enter contracts, or participate in legal proceedings without a male guardian. It suggests a monolithic legal system where women were uniformly oppressed and disenfranchised. However, this sweeping generalization ignores the remarkable diversity and nuance of medieval legal systems and the various ways in which women, depending on their social status, region, and marital situation, exercise significant legal agency. While not possessing equal rights to men in all regards, medieval women had a surprising array of legal entitlements and were far from powerless in the eyes of the law. One of the most significant legal rights for women, particularly widows, was dower. This common law provision, widespread across much of Europe, guaranteed a widow a lifetime interest in a portion, typically 1/3, of her deceased husband's land or income. This was not a gift but a legal right, ensuring her economic security and independence. A widow could manage this dower property, collect rents, and even sell or lease it. She could use it to support herself and her children, and she was often free from male guardianship, becoming a feme sole or woman alone in legal terms. This legal status meant she could enter into contracts, buy and sell property, engage in trade, and bring lawsuits in her own name. Many urban widows successfully continued their husbands' businesses, indicating their legal capacity to do so. The legal independence granted to widows was a powerful counterpoint to the idea of universal female subjugation. Even married women, while generally under the legal concept of coverture in common law systems where a wife's legal identity was merged with her husband's, were not entirely without rights. In coverture meant that a married woman generally could not own property independently, enter into contracts, or sue without her husband. However, this was not absolute. There were often legal mechanisms, such as separate property agreements or prenuptial contracts, especially among the wealthy, that allowed women to retain control over their dowries or other assets. In some towns, particularly those with strong customary laws rather than common law, married women were sometimes recognized as feme sole traders, allowing them to engage in business independently of their husbands and to be legally accountable for their commercial activities. This provided crucial economic and legal agency for urban women involved in trade. Furthermore, a married woman could sometimes act on her husband's behalf in business or legal matters, effectively extending his legal persona, but giving her practical experience and influence. Women also had the right to inherit property, although typically sons took precedence. Daughters could inherit land, titles, or wealth, especially if there were no male heirs, or through specific entailment arrangements. This was particularly true for aristocratic women who could inherit vast estates and even duchies or countships, as exemplified by Eleanor of Aquitaine. These inheritances brought with them not just wealth, but also legal responsibilities and political power over tenants and lands. The legal mechanisms for female inheritance ensured the continuation of family lines and wealth, often placing women in positions of considerable legal and economic authority. Women could also bring cases to court, especially regarding property disputes, dower rights, or cases of violence. While they might need male representation in some common law courts, their right to seek legal redress was recognized. Church courts, which handled matters like marriage, divorce, and moral offenses, often provided women with more direct access to justice and a more favorable legal standing compared to secular courts. Women could testify, petition, and actively participate in legal proceedings, seeking to protect their rights or resolve grievances. The legal landscape varied significantly across different regions of medieval Europe. The Roman law, which influenced many parts of continental Europe, often granted women more property rights than common law. Customary laws in various towns and regions also developed unique provisions that granted women greater legal agency in specific contexts, particularly in commercial activities. Therefore, a woman's legal rights could be very different depending on whether she lived in England, France, Italy, or the Holy Roman Empire, and whether she lived in a rural village or a bustling city. The misconception of no legal rights simplifies a complex and evolving legal history. While medieval legal systems were undeniably patriarchal and women did not possess universal equality with men, they were far from legally invisible. They had specific recognized rights regarding property, inheritance, dower, and in certain contexts, trade and legal representation. And widows, in particular, often gained a remarkable degree of legal autonomy. Women actively engaged with the legal system to protect their interests, manage their assets, and seek justice. Their legal status, though often tied to their marital state and social standing, allowed for significant agency and influence, challenging the simplistic narrative of their absolute powerlessness.